Outside of the city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia stands a stupa, 17 stories high, filled with nearly 9,000 skulls, a grim reminder to the dangers of forced communalism. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge, a communist party, ruled over Cambodia. Their attempt at social engineering was modeled on China's Great Leap Forward, which had resulted in the Great Chinese Famine, another communist disaster, attempted to create an agrarian utopia. Of course, this utopia was not voluntary and led to widespread famine. During this period of time, 1.5 to 2 million people were killed, or around 1 in 4 Cambodians. The Khmer Rouge was supported largely by the Chinese Communist Party and received approval from Mao Zedong. It's estimated that 90% of the foreign aid that came to the Khmer Rouge was provided by Communist China. The Khmer Rouge focused primarily on the rural peasantry rather than the urban proletariat, and sought to abolish personal interests and promoted communal living and eating. In short, rather than seeing all men as created equal in the eyes of their creator, they attempted to make all men exactly the same. In order to create this agricultural utopia, the Khmer Rouge told residents of cities, as in Phnom Penh, that they would be moved 2 to 3 kilometers outside of the city, but would be returned home in, quote, 2 or 3 days. Nothing like a government promise of short-term sacrifice, am I right? Anyone that refused to evacuate, however, would be killed immediately. The evacuees were then sent on long marches to the countryside, which was very hard on the thousands of children, elderly, and sick people. But who cares when you have a utopian ideology to fulfill? The peasants' farms were collectivized, and the former urbanites were sent to work with the farmers. Of course, the lack of prior agricultural knowledge on the part of the city dwellers made famine inevitable. Dedication to the ideology was so hysterical that even something as simple as going out and picking wild fruits or berries were seen as private enterprise and punished with death. Furthermore, executions were commonplace for those that attempted to escape, breached minor rules, or were denounced by their colleagues. Sex outside of marriage was also punishable by execution, and marriage itself required permission from the ruling authorities. These marriages were designed to increase people's dependency on the regime by undermining existing family and other loyalties. And we see this as a very common feature of leftist ideology as they seek to atomize the population, break people down by class, race, gender, further divide and subdivide and pit others against each other. And without these family structures, extended relation structures, the institution of churches and community, people become more and more dependent on the government and less able to resist. The Khmer Rouge embraced what was basically a form of functional illiteracy, where people were only taught the very basics of how to read. Their goal was to gain full control of all of the information that the Cambodian people received and spread only their revolutionary culture. Education came to a virtual standstill during this time, and higher education was considered by the ruling class as useless and highly suspect. It was because of this mass paranoia and distrust and the desire for the complete and total control over every aspect of their citizens' lives that the mass executions took place. There are more than 300 killing fields scattered throughout Cambodia, but it's Shuang Ek outside of Phnom Penh that are the most infamous. Tammy Burns of the Urban Adventures blog relates her experience of walking through these killing fields. We stop at the first tree on our path, a gnarled creature with sawed limbs and wild roots. We are told it's where Khmer Rouge soldiers would hang speakers, blasting music to drown out victims' cries, so that neighboring villagers wouldn't hear. The fields and the killings that took place there were a poorly kept secret from the Cambodian people. When people were taken away, families were told it was for their re-education, but few ever returned home. We stop at another tree, decorated in colorful friendship bracelets. Our guide is vague as he explains the tree's significance. He tells us people are particularly affected by this sight and want to leave mementos behind. He doesn't say more and walks away. As I move along the path, I finally read the sign beside the tree and realize why the guide didn't say the words out loud. Killing tree, against which executioners beat children. It reads in both English and Khmer. We pass by mass graves, and then the remains of holding rooms and tool sheds that were destroyed by newly freed Cambodians after Pol Pot's regime was overthrown. They wanted to get rid of the bad memories, our guide explains. I toe kick at an orange brick pointing out of the ground beneath my feet, partially buried under 40 years of dust and dirt. The sign beside me says this used to be the waiting room, where prisoners would await their turn to be executed. At the center of the fields is the Tower of Skulls, a pagoda made with the remains of thousands that were exhumed after the fall of the regime. These remains found in the mass graves are the skulls that are marked with dots of color, indicating how the person was killed. Bullets, hatchets, chemicals. The pagoda itself is small and closed in with glass walls, and you have to shuffle the perimeter that's no more than 3 feet wide, trapping you between the Tower of Skulls and the outside world. I look up, and when I see how high the tower goes, I panic. I want out and start pushing my way past people, desperately trying to get away from this claustrophobic glass cage where I'm surrounded by death and tragedy. Every year on the 20th of May, a ceremony is held around the stupa that is believed to help bring peace to the spirits of the deceased. Back in Phnom Penh itself stands the Genocide Museum, known as S21. USHMM.org describes S21 as the most notorious of the 189 interrogation centers in Cambodia, and was a former school, now called Tuol Sleng, for the hill on which it stands. Between 14,000 and 17,000 prisoners were detained there, often in primitive brick cells built in former classrooms. Only 12 prisoners are believed to have survived. S21 confined mostly elite prisoners from the Khmer Rouge's own ranks. Their jailers kept meticulous records, taking black and white mugshots of prisoners on entry, and used electric shocks, beatings, and water poured in the nose to extract elaborate written confessions to real and imagined offenses, being in the pay of the CIA or the Vietnamese or a purged Khmer Rouge figure were commonly forced confessions. Much like the communist revolution in Russia, we can see that once the party deals with external enemies and the floodgates to violence have been opened, and the destructive Marxist machine begins consuming itself. And so we can see a pattern that is played out far too many times in history, and we can see this blueprint being used even in the West today for those that seek to concentrate power in the hands of a few. No matter how noble the cause may sound on paper, save the environment, end inequality, it'll be great. And so we have the warning, any ideal society, any utopia, any better world can't rely on merely expeditious means. The ends cannot justify the means. If you have an ideal, every step in the achievement of that ideal must be worthy. Although it may seem slower, although it may seem to take longer, the shortcuts, the silencing, the censorship, the disarming, the atomization of populations, the tearing everything down, the destruction of trusted institutions. Maybe it helps to get to some sort of ideological political goal faster, but that doesn't lead to a better world. If this fanaticism isn't tempered, if it isn't checked, if it isn't held back, all it will lead to is the building of our own Temple of Skulls.